fun stories nonetheless for her dad to tell at gathering time. At least that's the way it used to be. Whenever she'd worn the sword, she'd...
Okay, as you can see, I have finished my Woodchuck. And I wanted to show it to you before I proceed with my Coyote. But let me show you the way it looks a little closer. Hold on. Ah, a little big. Actually, it's kind of funny, that little picture is more the real size. That's the way it looks under the microscope. Actually, it looks bigger under the microscope, but that's the best way I can show it to you. And I have to put it sideways to show it in its entirety. So, here it is. You can say goodbye to the chickmuck. No, sorry. The woodchuck. I'm going to start on the coyote. Yeah, it's still working. I was curious. So let me turn it over. I can show you bigger. I can show you a little head bigger. I think he got a nice expression. I'm kind of pleased with his finger too. Look. I don't know the actual finger, but anyway. Goodbye. And now here is a coyote. Sorry. Yep, here you are. That one I cannot show it in its entirety either. Too big. But I can show you more of it. Going to put some of that stuff. Try to remove some of the glare. Oh, now I just have to do it. And I am also going to start my audiobook. Okay, babe. Here we are. Oh, it's the wrong one now. Oh, forgot my picture. Yeah, here you are. I know I'm a little slow. Of course, now I cannot find it. Quel plaisir, dude. Quel play. Can never find what I need. Ah.
power of her family with her. But she never thought she'd actually have to use it one day. It was a good prop, something to scare the locals. It was like an unspoken rule. You just don't fuck with a woman with a sword. But that was all over now. She'd wanted to clean the blood off immediately, as if doing so would wipe the event from history. The sword having forgotten that it had seen bloodshed under her care. But she hadn't done it. Partially because she'd been in a hurry to report to the captain, but also because she never wanted to touch it again. She'd taken a life with that sword, and in return she'd given up a small piece of herself she could never get back. She had taken one dark step toward life in the Sargan Commonwealth, or some other equally nefarious organization. The type of organization that recruited killers for even the most basic of jobs. Before she knew it, she would be out there slicing people down left and right, all for a small bit of coin. It was inevitable. Evie shook her head, willing the thoughts to dissipate. She didn't have time for that nonsense. She needed to find out if the former prisoners knew anything about Venus' plans and where to find her. Because now there was more at stake than just one lost Coalition ship and her crew. The Atlas could change the balance of power in this region of space for hundreds, if not thousands of years. She took one step forward, and the door slid open for her. Inside, only 2 of the former prisoners remained, still being tended to by the nurses. Evie sought out Zax, finding her in her office as she interfaced with her console. No doubt, writing her meticulous reports she'd heard were more boring to read than the serial numbers off a Type 7 ship shuttle. Where did the rest of them go? Evie asked. Zax didn't turn around, only continued typing with her 2 four-fingered hands, while her 2 three-fingered hands examined a scanning device. I assigned them quarters and released them there, Zax said. They've had a taxing few days, and need the rest. They were in no immediate danger. And those 2? Evie asked, glancing beyond the doorway back into the main sickbay area. Just finishing up with them. They both had slight infections. Evie turned back to Zax. Nothing contagious? Zax turned around, her tiny mouth smiling. Of course not. Just a side effect of being cooped up in that box for a few days. I'm surprised it hadn't spread to all of them. Can I speak with them? They might have information about our mission, Evie said. Be my guest. But they've been through a traumatic ordeal. They need rest as soon as they can get it. Evie nodded, leaving the doctor to her work. Both former prisoners remained silent as she made her way over to them, not taking their eyes off her. They were the 2 who had helped find the tracker on Cass's ship. When the nurses saw her approaching, they left to give them privacy. I never got the chance to thank you for your help, Evie said, stopping a few meters from their beds. The girl's short legs dangled off the side, swishing back and forth, as if she were on a swing. Consider it repayment for rescuing us, the man Setsuma said. We owe you more than we can repay. She held her hands up. The Coalition doesn't require repayment. You're free to stay and become citizens if you like, or we can return you to Paxi. Though since it isn't Sargan space, it will take time to return you. Special requisitions will need to be made, and a stealth team. Setsuma put his hand up, cutting her off. I wouldn't dream of going back, he said. I've always been curious about the Coalition, just never had the means to get here. Evie turned to the girl. And you? I'll go back. My parents were captured at the same time I was. I need to try and save them. Evie's heart went out to the girl, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of deja vu. Don't you have any other family members? Anyone else you could stay with? The girl shook her head. Evie dropped her gaze for a moment. I'll see what I can do. But first, I need to know if you have any information about Venus' plans or capabilities. Maybe you overheard something while you were in the container. Maybe something Rasp or one of the others said. You may not even think it is important. Setsuma furrowed his brow. Like I told your crewmate, I was scheduled to be shipped to Cassiopeia. We were with a much larger group from Paxi and a few other worlds, I think. But then they pulled 5 of us to the side and stuffed us in that container. I heard Rasp say we were an emergency payment. Where were you being held? Evie asked. Before the container? Devil's Gate, the lower levels, Setsuma replied. Damn. They'd been right under her the whole time, and she hadn't even known. When you were packed, did you notice anything? Hear anything? She was there, Yan said as Setsuma opened his mouth to respond. Evie turned to her. Who? Vina. I recognized her voice. She was on Paxi too, helping to round us up. That's where I first heard her voice. I heard it again when they were separating us from the main group, but I never saw her. Could it have been a comm? Evie asked. I don't think so. She said she wanted to deal with this one personally. Yance continued to swing her feet back and forth. Cass had been right. Vina was close. Is there anything else? She asked. She has at least 2 ships, Setsuma said. How could you know that? Back on the ship, when we were trying to find the tracker, I overheard you say we were being pursued by 4 Class 2 gunners, Setsuma said. I'm assuming they were Sargan Steel Ravens. Evie nodded. Those are typically only launched from a battleship, either a Vortex or Darkness class vessel. But those types of ships are small, built for maneuvering in a planet's atmosphere. They can only carry 3 Steel Ravens per ship. So if we were being pursued by 4, she had a second ship somewhere. Evie eyed him. You know a lot about Sargan starships, she said. Setsuma gave her a sheepish grin. I lied to your crewmate about being an architect. But I was afraid if I told you what I really did, he'd throw me out of an airlock. He paused, but Evie indicated for him to go on. I used to be a ship designer for the Sargans, before my gambling and entertainment debts grew too large. I became more valuable as a saleable good than as an employee. Evie turned to Yance. And you? Anything you want to reveal? The girl shook her head. Evie returned her attention to Setsuma. Technically, you're a criminal, she said. So I'll have to confine you to quarters. But your help won't be without merit. It may just take you longer to earn your freedom. I'm no stranger to the inside of a cell, he replied, beaming with anticipation. I'll gladly pay off my debt, as required by the Great Coalition. Finally, Evie thought, someone who gets it. Evie returned to the bridge, her body humming with activity. She'd returned to her quarters to change her uniform and gather her thoughts, but had seen the sword again and thought better of it. As she walked on the bridge, she caught a nasty look from Lieutenant Page, but dismissed it. It was no secret he didn't like Cass, and now his ambivalence had seeped over to Evie, just as she suspected it eventually would if she continued to interact with the criminal. But that didn't matter anymore. She knew the truth, and so she ignored Page as she made her way to the station. Green was in his command room. Saul, she said, taking her chair. The alien glanced up from his console. Scan the system for twin undercurrent trails, Sargan signatures. We're looking for 2 or more close together, possibly a small fleet. They were still hidden behind the 3rd planet of Karpur, but their sensors should be able to pick up residual undercurrent trails if anyone had jumped from the system. Yes, Commander, Zal said, going about his work with efficient speed. Lieutenant, she said, indicating Page, I want full weapons readiness. Make sure everything is operating at top efficiency, she said. Is this because of what that traitor told you? Page asked. You have to know he's lying to us. He killed 24 Coalition crew members. We can't trust...
Lieutenant, Evie growled, follow your orders or I'll have you relieved.
Page sneered, but returned to his station, beginning his preparations for weapons drills. Evie took a deep breath and sunk back into her chair. Stubborn ass. Despite her short time on the ship, she hadn't seen Page this agitated before. In fact, before Cass had come on board, he'd seemed like one of the most level-headed officers on the ship. Smart, capable, and professional. Was this how everyone felt about Cass? Yamashita hadn't been too happy with him down in Jatan, but she hadn't been as overtly hostile as Page. What if they all knew the truth? Could she even risk revealing what really happened without risking a court-martial herself? What if the same thing happened and the crew banded together against her? Green wouldn't allow that, though. Not if what she knew about the man was accurate. He wasn't someone who could be bullied into silence. She couldn't focus on that right now. She had a job to do. If what Setsuma and Yance told her was true, then Vina had been close to or on Jatan after all. And her goal had been to recapture Cass. And since she hadn't gotten him, she might be even more desperate to find the Atlas now. This had just turned from a search and rescue into a race to the finish line.
Commander, Zal said, I may have something, but it's faint. We'll have to move out from behind Carper 3 to get a better lock.
Captain to the bridge, she announced. The autocom would notify Green without her needing to make a specific request. The doors to the hypervator opened to reveal Cass at the same time Green's command doors opened. Somebody call me? Cass said with a smile. You insolent, Page said, stepping out from behind the station. Stand down, Lieutenant, Green said, making his way into the center of the room. He glanced over at Evie. Commander? Evie glanced from Cass to Green and back again. Sir, we may have a lock on the Sargans. She motioned to Zal. Cass turned his attention to Zal, who was working his controls while his body remained rigid. The hard-light projection didn't do much as far as realism was concerned. It only looked human. It didn't move like a human. We need to move the ship to confirm the undercurrent trail, Zal reported to the captain. Cass spoke up. Where is it? He asked. Where does it lead? It's hard to tell from here, but I would extrapolate Quadro Sigma, Zal said. Cass shook his head. It's a false trail. She's got no reason to head in that direction. That's off Port Sill space, the wrong direction. By now, she has to know we're looking for her. She'll have set up decoys, anything to delay us. He turned to Evie. What did you find out? She stood. You were right. Vina is close, or she was. She has more than one ship searching. Cass nodded. She probably brought a small fleet. She won't give up easily. So now we're getting dragged into a war with the Sargans? How much trouble is this guy worth? Page asked. That's enough, Lieutenant, Green said. Mr. Rabot, I assume there's a reason you're on my bridge. Cass held up the tracker. With some help from your very capable chief engineer, we figured out how to track her. We managed to rig it to ping the original signal back to its source. Cass caught the eye of Blum at the bridge engineering station. Her face was impassive, but her eyes showed interest. We can use it without her knowing our position? Green asked. Cass nodded. I thought we were supposed to be looking for one of our ships, not tracking some Sargan scum, Page said. Green furrowed his brow. Zal, integrate the device into our systems. I want to find out which way they went, he said. Zal nodded, then seemed to float over to Cass, taking the tracker from him. Cass caught the touch of one of his hard-light fingers. It was freezing to the touch. Commander, your thoughts? Green took the captain's chair as Zal returned to his station.
If we find the Atlas and try to tow it back to Coalition space, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the Sargans. We need to find them first and throw them off the trail. Get them to waste their time searching elsewhere. Then we can bring it back without a fight, Evie said. Cass stood in front of the specialist station, which was still dark. Like I said, she won't give up easily, Cass said. I agree, we need to bring the fight to her, if for no other reason than to make sure she doesn't already have the ship. We should be able to tell by her heading. If she's on her way back to Sargan space, then we'll know. She'll already have her prize. Green nodded. Lieutenant Rond, move us out from behind Carper 3. Blackburn, plot a course along the trail indicated from Zal's station. Zal, activate the reverse tracker and take us in. Zal nodded, working the controls and bringing up his information on the primary display in the middle of the room. It also appeared in the 2D Master Systems display on the far wall. A blinking dot less than a light year away highlighted the screen. There she is, Cass said. As best he could tell, her course indicated she was moving away from Carper back to Sargan space. She must have just left Carper. She hasn't gotten very far. Ensign Blackburn, set pursuit course, nearest undercurrent, Green ordered. Aye, Blackburn responded, building the navigation plan on the display before them, as Rond reoriented the ship. Cass took a seat in the specialist's chair, preparing to enter the undercurrent. ETA is less than 30 minutes, Blackburn announced once the route was complete. How is that possible? Cass exclaimed, standing back up. Assuming Vina left Jatan as soon as her last crippled fighter made its way back to her main ship, meant she should have at least an hour on them. Was the Tempest really that fast? Green smiled. You should ask Commander Sester, he said, keeping his attention on the primary display. It's his engine. Security to the bridge, Page said. Lieutenant? Evie asked, standing as well. Just an escort for our guest, Page said. He doesn't need to be on the bridge if we're going into battle. Cass glanced at Green. I'm afraid I have to concur with our tactical officer. Civilians aren't allowed on the bridge during war times. Neither are criminals, Page added, smirking with satisfaction. The main hypervator doors opened behind Cass, revealing 2 security officers. I might be able to help, give you some insight about the Sargan systems, Cass said, as the officers came over and stood behind the station. We'll take it from here. Thank you for your help, Mr. Riveau, Green said. Cass shot a look at Evie, but she only gave a light shrug. He supposed he should have been grateful for as much access as he'd been given. He was sure they could handle the Sargans. He might as well return to Bay 1 and help Box finish the repairs. Cass nodded and allowed himself to be escorted back to the hypervator. The door slid open, and the security officers followed him in, and he watched the bridge disappear. Why was he feeling such an ache to remain up there? Did he just want to be part of the action? Or was it something more? Box would probably call it a sense of duty, but that couldn't be it. Any sense of duty he'd had died long ago. Bay 1, Cass announced, as he realized no one in the hypervator had specified a destination. However, the computer didn't provide its normal chime, instead blaring the command rejected chime. This hadn't been a problem before. Had they revoked all of his autonomy? He turned to one of the security officers. Would you mind? Looks like I've been grounded. The officer grinned. You could put it that way, he said. The hypervator stopped, and the officers escorted him out. Something was wrong. This wasn't the way to Bay 1. Fellas, I think there's been a mistake here, he said. No mistake, the other one responded. Lieutenant Page instructed us to detain you, and that's what we're doing. You're putting me in the brig? Cass shouted. I don't believe this. Check with the captain, or Commander Diazol.
Neither of them approved this order. The lieutenant is head of security, one of them said. He doesn't need their approval. It's his call. Oh, you have to be shitting me, Cass said, as they led him down the hallway toward the brig. As the possibilities ran through his mind, throwing him deeper and deeper into panic as they came closer to the brig doors, the ship shook, throwing them all off balance. Cass hit the back wall hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. Lights in the hallway blared, and the general alert sounded. Cass took advantage of the momentary confusion to run back down the hallway to the hypervator, leaving the two security officers still managing to regain their footing. Come on, come on! Cass hit the panel as he waited for the hypervator. The ship shook again, throwing him against the sidewall. He glanced behind him to see one of the officers' faces hit the ground with a smack. The hypervator doors opened, and Cass jumped inside, allowing the doors to close again before the guards could scramble back to him. Once he was inside, he pulled the main control panel from the wall and yanked the two cables connecting the voice command system. The hypervator wouldn't move for his voice, but he could still input a manual test code, something he'd never forgotten from the academy. As he worked, he pulled his comm out of his pocket and sent a message to Box. "Yeah, boss," the robot said on the other side. "What's going on? I'm stuck in the middle of the ship. I don't have any eyes down here." "According to the excuses sensors," Box said, "we're under attack by Sargan ships. Hey, I bet that's Vina. She really doesn't give up." "You think?" Cass yelled, inputting the last command. The hypervator began moving again. "I'm headed back to the bridge to find out what's going on. Get the excuses ready as you can. We might have to make a hasty getaway." "Already on it," Box said, and cut the comm. As the hypervator rose, the ship shook again, this time much more violently than the last two. What had happened out there? Why wasn't Green running? This ship should easily be able to put enough distance between them and the Sargans. Finally, the hypervator slowed, and the doors opened. Except they opened on chaos. The bridge was a different world than the one he'd only left a few minutes before. A piece of the bulkhead was hanging from the ceiling, having smashed the primary display system in the middle of the room. Green and Edie were barking orders, while smoke billowed from one of the side stations. Page and Zal were frantically trying to maneuver the ship, and Cass could see why. Blackburn had taken a piece of the bulkhead directly to the middle of her chest. She was dead in her seat, as Ront tried to compensate for the loss of their navigation station. The whole room was flashing red. Cass glanced around the chaos to the 2D display on the far side of the room. 5 Sargan ships were on the screen, the largest being Vina's own dreadnought warship, at least 4 times the size of Tempest. And there, trapped in her tractor beam, was his old ship, the Atlas. Cass dashed over to Blom's station, jumping over debris and ducking the bulkhead. She was bleeding from a cut on her head and was seemingly having trouble focusing. "What the hell happened?" Cass yelled. "They were supposed to be 30 minutes away." "As soon as we locked onto their signal, they appeared. It must have been a decoy," she said, slurring her words. Evie ran up beside them, taking Blom's head in her hands. "She's got a concussion. Take the station," Evie yelled, helping Blom out of the chair. Cass glanced down at the engineering station as the ship shook again. He had to grip the side of the console to keep from flying off his feet. There was an oof and a thump to his right. He glanced over to see Evie and Blom sprawled against the wall. He ran over to help, but Evie waved him away. "Get the goddamn engines back online," she yelled. Cass nodded and returned to the station, wiping part of the console covered in Blom's blood with his sleeve. He examined the systems. It looked like there had been an overload in the primary conduits when they came out of the undercurrent. The ship lurched to the left as Rond worked his controls, almost sending Cass out of his seat again. He hit the emergency restraints, which shot out from the seat and secured him in. A quick glance confirmed the dampeners were only working at 46% capacity. That would make an undercurrent jump uncomfortable, to say the least. One problem at a time. He had to figure out how to get them out of here. Evie said the engines were off, but as far as he could tell, they were working fine. But the primaries were out, and the backups hadn't kicked in, which meant no matter how much power they shunted to the engines, they wouldn't be moving until the connections were in place. Cass hit the comm button down to main engineering. Engineering, this is the bridge. Are you seeing what we're seeing up here? The primaries are out. This is Ensign Tyler, sir, a young voice answered. We've almost got them back. Transfer to the secondary for now. Worry about the primaries later, Cass said. Sir, but won't that blow that? Don't argue, just do it. We stay here any longer, and we won't have primaries. Understand? Yes, sir, Tyler said, cutting the connection. Evasive maneuvers. Page, where is my firepower? Green yelled. Blades away, Page said. Cass glanced up to the screen momentarily to see two curved energy beams make their way toward the closest Sarkhan ship. They made a good hit, but as soon as the damaged ship pulled back, another took its place and continued firing on Tempest. Cass worked as fast as he could on the console, reinforcing the secondary systems with temporary force shields, hoping they could hold the amount of power he was about to send through them. It was just like falling back into an old habit. He'd used the same maneuver on the Atlas more than once when they'd been in dire straits. It was amazing how quickly it all came back to him. This ship might be the most advanced ship of the fleet, but it was still a coalition vessel underneath. Seconds later, the secondaries came online. Thank you, Tyler, Cass said under his breath. Instead of waiting for an order, Cass initiated the array and opened up the nearest undercurrent. Get us there now, Lieutenant, Green yelled, pointing at the undercurrent on the screen. Ron, sweat pouring down his brow, nodded and focused on the task at hand. Page, cover the rear. 3 seconds later, they reached the undercurrent. Full thrust, Green yelled, his hands gripping the sides of his chair. Brace, Cass yelled, keeping his eye on the dampener fields. He only hoped they'd be enough so the entire crew wasn't turned into soup accelerating so quickly. The ship lurched dramatically and pulled Cass back into his seat so hard he thought it would break from its housing. Within a few seconds, the sensation dissipated. Clear, Evie announced. Sometime in the confusion, she made it back to her station. Green slumped back into his chair. Get me a full damage report. He took a look at Blackburn, slumped over in her chair, her eyes still open. Medical to the bridge. Cass secured the engineering station and made sure everything was stable. The secondaries were holding, thank goodness, which meant they should be able to sustain their speed for at least long enough to get out of range of Vina. He made his way over to Evie. What happened? It's like as soon as I left, everything went to hell. It was a trap, Evie said. She knew our position the moment we entered the undercurrent. We thought we could sneak up on her, but she was ready with her fleet. They ambushed us. The ship took a direct hit before we could even get the main shields up. The secondary hypervator doors opened to reveal 2 medics who hustled into the bridge. One hunched down over Blom, who was sprawled out on the floor behind Evie's station. The other made her way over to Blackburn. Cass released his restraints and pulled his comm from his belt. Box, what's your status? Shaken, but only barely stirred, Box replied. The ship? I've got communication equipment all over the place, and your room is a mess. But other than that, she's fine. The ship smells like alcohol. I think your bottle's broke. Get up to the bridge as soon as you can. I need you up here. Cass heard what sounded like a high-pitched squeal on the other end as Box cut the communication. Diazol, report, Green said from his chair. He was out of breath, and sweat peppered his brow, but he was focused, determined not to let his crew down. For the first time in a long time, Cass saw a captain he could actually admire. We should be out of range by now, Evie said. Cass got the engines back up, and with our advantage, if she's coming after us, it will take her twice as long to reach our position if we stop now. Understood. Full stop, Green said. Rond worked the controls, and the ship lurched to a halt, the dampener still only providing minimal protection from the inertia. Cass took a moment to survey the bridge. It was a mess. It would take weeks in space dock to repair. Somehow, Vina had known right where to hit them. I want to know what the hell happened. How was she there waiting for us? Green asked. I can take a pretty good guess, Page said, looking at Cass from the tactical station. He had a cut above his right eye, and the blood had run down the side of his face. Green ignored him. Saul? Checking now, sir, Saul said. His hard-light simulation was unscathed, though Cass wondered if the creature underneath had suffered any injuries. The doors to the main hyperveator opened to reveal Box, his yellow eyes blinking rapidly in excitement. Cass jumped out from his station and ran to his companion. Help us over here. We have to get this bulkhead off Blackburn. Cass glanced over at the medic, who was trying to reach the ensign, but with a massive piece of metal in the way, was having little luck. Blackburn deserved more than to stay pinned to her station like a piece of skewered meat. Box jogged over and pulled the bulkhead away, the sharp piece of metal that had penetrated Blackburn's sternum coming out easily. Box set the bulkhead down as the medic reached the ensign, closing her eyes. Behind her, Ron seethed. They must have been close. Box stood back. This isn't exactly what I had in mind during my first visit to the bridge, he said. Sir, I believe I found the issue, Saul reported. The tracker provided by Mr. Rabot had a failsafe built into it. It didn't activate until we were within a certain proximity of the Sargan ships. I knew it, Page said, coming out from around his terminal. Just can't help yourself, can you, Rabot? Have to kill crew members on every mission you're a part of. Lieutenant, Green shouted, standing again. Page froze, but didn't take his eyes off Cass. Mr. Rabot, Commander, with me, right now. He turned and made his way to his command room. Page, you have the bridge. Cass noticed the other medic was already helping Blom to the hypervator. Backup shifts, report to the bridge, Page yelled, as Cass followed Green into the command room, with Evie right behind him. As soon as the doors closed behind her, Green laid into him. I do not take being played for a fool easily, Mr. Rabot, Green snapped. Tell me I haven't misjudged you. You haven't, Cass said. Sir, adding the last bit because it felt wrong not to do so. Did you have any idea about a backup in the tracker? Green asked. No, sir. But it's my fault. Box wanted to destroy the tracker as soon as we found it. But I thought we could use it. It was my idea to use it to trace her position back. I guess she was counting on that. She knows you, Evie said. She knew if you found it, you wouldn't want to let her get away. Green walked around behind his desk. It seems she's had the upper hand this entire time. He pressed a panel on his desk. Lieutenant Zoll? Sir? Zoll's voice came through the comm. Destroy that tracker. Yes, sir. Green cut the comm. It appears I have underestimated the Sargan's desire to have that ship. It's not even about the ship, Cass said. Vina probably still doesn't know what it can do. She's more interested in selling the weapon to one of the other Sargan dealers. Someone who will use it to their own ends. She might even try to sell it to the heads of the Sargan Commonwealth themselves. And then we'll have a war on our hands, Green said. If they have a weapon based on SIL technology, nothing will stop them from breaking right through our borders and taking whatever they want. I don't understand, Evie said. She already has the ship and crew in her possession. Why does she still want you? Cass shrugged. My bet would be she doesn't like losing things. There's an old Sargan saying, once inside, doors disappear. It means you can come and go, but you never really leave. I'm her possession. Also, if I had to guess, the crew of the Atlas isn't being very cooperative. Maybe she thinks I can help her use the weapon. Do you think she captured the crew of the dry dock as well? Evie asked. Green shook his head. I don't know. He tapped his panel again. Lieutenant Page, report to my command room. A moment later, the doors opened to reveal Page. Blood still smeared the side of his face. He shot a nasty glance at Cass, but kept his composure. Lieutenant, give me a tactical analysis of the Sargans out there, Green said. 5 ships in total. We disabled 2 of the smaller vessels. But the largest ship, the Dreadnought, we're no match for. We need a coalition warship or destroyer to take on something of that size. We can't survive another confrontation like that, especially if they know we're coming. We've taken care of that issue, Green said. Are you going to tell him about how you tried to have me arrested? Cass asked. Page furrowed his brow as Green stared at him. Lieutenant? It was for the safety of the ship, Page said. I didn't want him roaming around when we were going into a combat zone. Couldn't just confine me to quarters? Or to my own ship? Cass asked. That's enough, Green said. This bickering gets us nowhere. Lieutenant, return to the bridge and oversee repairs. Commander, as you're the only one who doesn't hate Mr. Rabot, I want you to escort him back to his ship, where he will remain until we have sorted through this mess. Yes, sir, Evie and Page said together. And get that robot off my bridge, he added. Wait, what are you going to do? Cass asked. I see no choice but to make my report to Admiral Rutledge and await reinforcements from the fleet, Green replied. You can't do that. Rutledge won't just send reinforcements, Cass said. He's already skittish enough. You tell him the ship was captured by the Sargans, he'll probably make a case for all-out war to the Coalition Council himself. Remember, he's not the only one who knows about this project. What project? Page asked, glancing between the 3 of them. Then what would you suggest, Rabot? You heard the lieutenant. We're outclassed and outgunned. They have the ship. What am I supposed to do? Green asked, flustered. Send me over there, Cass said. Send me, and I'll blow it up. "32. Page had to contain himself to keep from bursting out laughing. You? We're supposed to trust you to go back over to the woman you used to work for and blow up your own ship? Cass nodded. Give me a break. He glanced over to the captain. You can't seriously be considering this. As soon as he gets over there, he'll reveal our position, and the Sargans will have 2 ships to tow back instead of 1. Seems to me if he'd wanted to betray us, he would have already done it by now, Evie said. What do you call that out there? Page shouted. They were waiting for us. He led us straight into a trap with that damn tracker of his. And if he'd wanted us to stay dead in the water, he wouldn't have gotten the engines back up and running, Evie argued. The Sargans had us dead to rights. Page turned back to Green. Sir, don't do this. He's a convicted criminal. 24 deaths because of his action. Another 5 today. He's a walking slaughterhouse. 5. A pit erupted at the bottom of Cass's stomach. He'd hoped the casualties had been limited to Ensign Blackburn, but he'd been wrong. Maybe he didn't deserve to take down the Atlas. Maybe he deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Oh, for shit's sake.
After all, if not for Cass, all those crew members would still be alive. Green faced Cass. How would you do it? Get to your ship? Cass shook the thoughts away.
Audible Inc. presents Ground Zero, written by Nicholas Ryan, narrated by Vikas Adam. Prologue. The Wrath. The skyline of Baltimore hunched low on the horizon, appearing from out of the ocean in a silhouette of gleaming towers above a blanket of gray morning haze. Barrows Asghari stood by the freighter's starboard rail and stared towards the city. He had been watching since dawn, waiting for this moment, waiting for his first sight of the accursed place. He had sensed the land, felt its vast, restless presence in the darkness, tasted the scent of its corruption and greed on the breeze, like a fetid cloying tang in the back of his throat. "I see you, great Satan," he muttered softly, his voice edged with the intensity of his hatred. "And there will be no escape from the wrath I bring." He glanced at his wristwatch and headed to his cabin. The freighter was scheduled to dock at noon, but he knew not to trust local authorities to maintain the schedule. No. He must wait until the last possible moment. His trainers had been clear on this matter. He had to be certain the ship was well within the harbor before he could take the final step. His sleeping quarters was a narrow, cramped space the size of a prison cell, with bunk beds fixed to one wall and a small chest of drawers in a corner. Asghari dropped onto the bottom bunk and stared at the walls. Beyond the open door, he could hear the sounds of the ship slowly coming alive. Crewmen shuffling along the narrow corridors in heavy boots and hard hats and bright-colored safety vests. He closed his eyes and drew a deep, steadying breath. The sounds around him faded. The tension seeped from his body as though he were meditating, until his mind and imagination filled with flashing memories of the makeshift camp back in the hot wastelands west of Kashan. He remembered the Russian who had come, driven through the desert in a motorcade escorted by 6 trucks of elite Quds Force operatives. And he remembered the experiments the scientist had conducted on captured Iraqi soldiers, and the terrible madness that had infected them before their extermination. He remembered watching the bloody horror on the prisoners' faces as they died, and then reawakened into something hideous and vicious and inhuman. And how the Quds troopers had used fire, and then acid, and finally a hail of bullets to the head before the ghouls had finally dropped dead in their iron cages and lay still. Asghari smiled. Then his thoughts drifted to the defining moment of his life. The moment he had been driven through the cool night to a desert place south and east of Tehran where he had met the supreme Iranian leader, and been shown one of the vast underground bunkers that would be the new birthplace from which Islam would rise up victorious after the apocalypse. Asghari had wept with pride when the supreme leader had told him that it was his calling to be Allah's final martyr, and that his place in paradise would be assured, for he would be exalted as the greatest of all warriors. "God has ordained you as the weapon of his fury," the supreme leader had declared solemnly. The old man's voice shook with passion as he took Asghari's hands within his own. "You will slay the infidel by the thousand, as a panther among fast, listless sheep, and each drop of blood you draw will be celebrated in heaven." Asghari opened his eyes suddenly and stared at the cabin wall, surprised to find that his vision was misted with fresh tears at the memory. There was a swelling lump of pride in his throat. The Quran promised a paradise of green land, flowing streams, fruit, wine, and beautiful women, and his place there would be certain. For surely if those who had martyred themselves in the blast of a suicide bomb were walking in the gardens of paradise, then what greater reward would Allah bestow upon the believer who brought death upon 200 million of the hated Americans? Ascari reached down and unfastened the laces of one heavy work boot. There was a pocket knife in one of the dresser drawers, and he used it to lever the heel off, holding the boot carefully in his lap. Beneath the cover, protected by thick black rubber padding, was an aluminum vial, as thick as a cigarette, but only half as long. The cylinder was sealed in shrink-wrapped plastic. Ascari set the vial carefully on the mattress beside him. Then he refitted the heel and put the boot back on. He glanced at his wristwatch. It was almost 11 a.m. He could feel the ship's motion changing as she nosed her way carefully into Baltimore Harbor, surrounded by attending tugboats. The rolling pitch became more gradual, and the sound of the ship's engine throbbed and vibrated harshly up through the steel floor. Ascari leaned back against the cold wall and watched the time slowly tick away. He wondered where it would begin. The Russian had assured him the dose was small enough to allow his spirit time to reach heaven before the wrath would come upon his body. And Ascari believed the scientist. He had seen the effects of infected bites at the training camp, and had noted the reawakening rage had taken only minutes to make the Iraqi prisoners rise again and turn them insane with the madness. Ascari wondered whether his dead body would be taken to a hospital once they discovered him. Or perhaps he would be left lying cold on his bunk. That thought made him pause. He frowned for a moment. Did it matter? He didn't think so. But to be certain there would be no unnecessary delay transporting his corpse into the city, he took the counterfeit Egyptian passport and documents he had been issued in Tehran and tucked them into his shirt pocket. He smiled again, for by the time his body was found, he, Beroz Ascari, would be in paradise, and the terrible thing that remained of him would arise and be unstoppable. He broke the plastic seal and unscrewed the tiny cap of the vial. His hands shook with the thrill of his anticipation. He recited random extracts from the Quran, coming back again and again to the one passage that resonated like a drumbeat in his heart. Kill the aggressors wherever you find them. Drive them out of the places from which they drove you. Finally, he felt at peace. He muttered a last silent prayer, then closed his eyes and drank the virus. Then he swallowed the empty aluminum tube. Ascari felt nothing for long moments, and then a sudden heavy weight of drowsiness forced him back down on the bunk. He sighed. He thought of his home in Iran as he patiently waited to die, and then rise again as the deadly wrath of Allah. For God had willed it to be so. Chapter 1. The Infection. Arthur Harrigan died because he was old and cautious. Since his wife Martha had passed away, Arthur had lived a lonely, solitary life. He kept to himself. He stayed around the house. Every weekend he went out into the garden and did battle with the rose bushes. And once a week, his daughter in New York phoned to make sure he was still alive and not laying dead and maggot-infested on the kitchen floor. On Thursday morning, Arthur shuffled into the living room and switched on the television, then pulled the curtains open and stared out across the lawn. Beyond his front fence, the world was going about its business. Mrs. Jameson was standing by her mailbox chatting to the postman, and Doug Garvey was walking his dog. Arthur hated Garvey's little mutt, and if it crapped on the sidewalk out front of his house once more, he was going to give the man a piece of his mind. He watched silently until the wretched little flea bag had passed by his driveway, and then let the dusty curtains fall back into place. Arthur sighed. He was old man weary, with a kind of aches and pains that made every movement a slow, deliberate effort of will. He tottered to the big recliner and sat down with a heavy moan. The coffee table was in front of him. He stared down at the chessboard and made a face. Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games was lying open on the table. He picked the book up and snatched his spectacles from his cardigan pocket, perched the glasses on the end of his nose, and tried yet again to understand why Fischer had played his pawn to f4. He reread the enigmatic Grandmaster's cryptic annotation for the move, and shook his head in complete bewilderment. The mid-morning news bulletin was on in the background, and something unsettling in the tone of the presenter's voice instinctively compelled Arthur to look up sharply from the chess book and stare with rheumy eyes. Stage authorities have no explanation for the outbreak, the gray-suited TV announcer was saying, his face dark and deeply concerned. All we can confirm at the moment is that Baltimore's hospital system has been inundated with patients, as many as 150 at this stage, all seemingly presenting to medical staff with the same symptoms. Arthur set the book down in his lap and frowned. He felt suddenly uneasy. He used the remote to turn up the television volume. We're crossing now to Baltimore General Hospital, and we also have a reporter standing by in Atlanta where the director of research at the Center for Disease Control is preparing to make a statement to the media, the TV anchor explained. We'll cross there live as soon as the press conference starts. In the meantime, here's Carrie Sullivan with a report from Baltimore General. The image flickered and then switched from the studio to a young blonde reporter who was standing on a strip of green lawn out front of a vast concrete building. In the background, 2 ambulances suddenly came to camera shot, their lights flashing and sirens wailing as they braked hard out front of the hospital's emergency entrance. The woman reporter winced at the sound and glanced over her shoulder at the vehicles, then turned quickly back to the camera. Her face was flushed with hectic color, and her voice was wavering as she began her report. John, the scene here is one of utter panic. The woman reporter spoke quickly. A fleet of ambulances have been arriving at the hospital since earlier today, and the entire hospital has been shut down and quarantined on the orders of local authorities. That means no visitors allowed inside the building, and no one allowed out. It's really quite frightening. Arthur sat silently and stared at the television. The book slid from his lap, but he didn't notice. All his attention was on the images flickering across the screen. Overlaid above the woman reporter's voice, the TV station was playing pre-recorded footage taken earlier in the day, which showed a horde of blood-covered people on the streets of Baltimore, staggering towards 2 police cars. 3 cops were behind the vehicles. They had their weapons raised. The crowd staggered closer, walking trance-like, as though they were dazed and wounded. Then the camera zoomed in close on a single man in the crowd. His eyes were wide and crazed. His unshaven face was a mask of blood, his shirt torn and gore-spattered. His mouth was open, lips snarled back so that his teeth were bared into a vicious, maddening growl. Arthur heard one of the cops in the foreground shouting in panic. "Stand still! Get on the ground!" He shouted again, this time his voice strident and more desperate. "Get on the fucking ground!" One of the cops was holding a Remington 870 shotgun in the low-ready position. He was a big man, maybe in his mid-40s. He was solid across the chest and shoulders. He had steady eyes, the steely gaze of a man who had seen enough on the streets not to be easily rattled. He pumped the action of the weapon, and the menacing clack-clack sounded like an ominous warning. The crowd came closer. Suddenly there was a deafening roar as the officers opened fire simultaneously on the shambling man. The camera shook again. Arthur thought he could hear someone weeping. Then the lens focused onto the dead man's body, just in time to see him get slowly back to his feet. There was thick brown ooze seeping from huge ragged holes that had ripped his chest apart. Arthur Harrigan stopped breathing. "Jesus wept," he gasped. The cops fired again, and the blood-covered crowd around the downed figure suddenly erupted in a moan. A sound that was without form or coherence, but a wail so chilling and so demented that one of the policemen turned away and fled. The camera caught the horror on his face, the cop's jaw hanging slack, his ashen features twisted and contorted with fear and panic. Arthur heard a voice off camera shout, "Run for your fucking life!" And then the picture began to jerk and bounce. He could hear ragged breathing as the footage tilted at crazy angles, showing crowds of screaming, fleeing people, rushing in a chaotic mass of panic. He could hear car alarms in the background and the heavy thump of a helicopter's rotors somewhere overhead. The footage ended abruptly. The woman reporter was back on the television. She had one hand flat against the side of her face, her finger pressed to an earpiece. Behind her, another ambulance raced towards the hospital's emergency entrance. The camera zoomed past the announcer's shoulder and focused on the ambulance as the driver leaped urgently from the vehicle and ran to the back doors. He flung them open. Then, suddenly, a blood-covered woman leaped from inside the vehicle. She was young and slim, her face and hair red with gore. She was wearing a blouse and skirt. The blouse had been ripped open. She attacked the ambulance man with an enraged roar, clawing at his eyes. Her weight drove him backwards, and he crashed to the ground, flailing his arms and screaming in terror. The woman snarled at him, and her eyes were wild and inhuman. She tore at the man's face, ripping flesh from around his mouth, and then gouged at his eyes. The man thrashed and kicked. The woman trapped one of his arms and gnawed the ambulance man's wrist. The guy screamed, a blood-curdling roar of pain and terror, and clutched at the mangled wound. The woman was hunched on his chest like a beast driven to maddened frenzy. She lunged at the ambulance driver's neck and ripped at the flesh, then slowly lifted her head and looked around her. Her gaze was distant and mindless, but when she saw the cameraman and reporter, she became instantly alert. The woman reporter screamed. The ghoul spat the ambulance man's flesh from its mouth and rose slowly to its feet. She was awash with fresh blood. It dripped from her hands and from her face. It clotted on her blouse and down her legs. She opened her mouth and moaned. The camera pulled back until the woman reporter was in focus. She had her back turned, still staring at the bloody nightmare by the open doors of the ambulance. Slowly, she turned back to face the camera. Her face was bloodless white with shock. She was crying pitifully. "Oh, God," the reporter sobbed softly. "Oh, my God." She dropped to her knees, as though all the strength had suddenly gone from her body. In the background, the ghoul began to stagger towards the camera. Arthur Harrigan heaved himself out of the recliner and went to the bedroom. He had a pistol in the bedside drawer, an old revolver. He loaded the weapon with fumbling, trembling fingers and tucked it inside the belt of his trousers. Somewhere outside, maybe on the next block, he heard a gunshot, then another. He froze for a moment. Far away, the sound ebbing and fading on the breeze, was the familiar wail of a police siren. Arthur went to the bedroom window and ripped the curtains open. The afternoon was bright and sunny, but there was a haze of dark smoke on the horizon, billowing black and rising up like an ugly scar into the blue sky. Arthur went back into the living room. He stood by the window and checked the driveway. The street seemed clear, almost eerily quiet. The sirens in the distance were getting louder, coming closer. He took the gun from his belt. Somehow, the comforting weight of the weapon in his hand made him feel better. Safer. He locked the front door, then went through the hallway into the kitchen to secure the back door. When he came back into the living room, there was a grim-faced man on the television. He looked to be in his 50s. He had thinning gray hair. His eyes were dark and somber under bushy eyebrows. He was wearing a white lab coat and sitting stiffly behind a table covered in a twisting nest of microphones and voice recorders. Behind the man was a blue curtain with an embroidered white motif and the words, "Centers for Disease Control," beneath it. A thin red graphic at the bottom of the television screen flashed, "Live from Atlanta." Arthur edged closer to the television. "Morning, about 100 cases have been reported," a journalist's voice off camera was saying. "Is there an update on the number of people who have now been infected?" The spokesman stared stonily at the camera. "Over 1,000, he said. "And still counting." There was a murmur of voices, a flash of cameras, and then suddenly people seemed to be shouting at once. A single voice rose above the others. "Do you know how the outbreak started, or where it originated from?" The spokesman shook his head heavily. "No," he admitted. "The first suspicious report from Baltimore was of an Egyptian merchant seaman who was taken to Baltimore General late Tuesday afternoon. It remains unconfirmed whether that man was patient zero." "Unconfirmed?" One of the journalists sounded incredulous. "Why? Are you still running tests?" "No," the spokesman said. The hospital cannot locate the body." A stunned pall fell over the room. The CDC spokesman blinked under the harsh lights and mopped sweat from his brow. The man's hand was trembling. "Does the CDC have the outbreak under control?" a new voice asked. "No," the spokesman said frankly. Another clamor of voices, rising louder, desperate to be heard. "Do you know what we're dealing with?" "No," the man said, "but it appears to be viral, an infection that is being spread through bites and bodily fluid contamination. It's unlike anything we have ever encountered before." "Is it true these infected people are coming back to life after being killed?" The man said nothing. "What areas are being affected? How widespread is the outbreak?" another reporter asked in the brief silence. The spokesman turned his head and looked directly towards the reporter who had asked the question. "Baltimore. But spreading quickly," the man said. "We've already had reports from as far away as Virginia in the south and Pennsylvania to the north." The voices of the reporters became riotous, rising in a roar of disbelief. A woman's voice, sounding almost hysterical, shouted above the noise. "What do we do? What can be done to stop the spread?" Before the spokesman could answer, a second voice cried out, "Is this a plague?" "There is nothing we can do," the CDC spokesman said flatly in response to the first question. Then he paused for a long moment, as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "At this stage, we are advising people to stay in their houses and avoid contact with anyone." "Anyone," he said again to emphasize the point. "Infection spreads through bite attacks. You should do all you can to ensure you remain isolated from anyone displaying symptoms of erratic behavior or people with a clear disposition of anger or violence. Stay in your house and pray." There was another burst of camera flashes, and then a young man entered the picture. He clutched at the spokesman's arm and bent close to his ear to whisper urgently. The spokesman listened. Then he looked up suddenly and sharply into the young man's face. The other man nodded. The CDC spokesman screwed his eyes tightly shut for a long moment while the world watched on in silence. Finally, the man turned back towards the camera. His eyes were wet with tears, and his face stricken with pure fear. In the time I have been speaking to you, another 1,000 cases have been reported to medical staff across the northeast of the country, the spokesman said. Officially, the virus is out of control. The room fell into shocked silence. Finally, one reporter asked, almost fearfully, What? What are you calling the outbreak? Does it have a name? The spokesman shook his head. The infection is uncategorized, he said. Is this a zombie virus? One reporter asked, and his tone was earnest and fearful. Yes, the spokesman said after a long, agonizing pause. Because quite frankly, I don't know any other terminology to explain it. The infected are bitten and die in agony. Then they rise again. There is only one other word for it. Which is? Armageddon, the spokesman answered. This is the end of days. The end of life in America as we know it. Arthur Harrigan stared at the television in disbelief. He felt cold. A superstitious dread crawled like ice through his veins until his body trembled uncontrollably. He snatched for the phone. Suddenly he wanted more than anything else to hear the voice of his daughter. He called the number and stood in the hallway listening to the hollow tone as it rang out. He dialed again. Then suddenly the front door exploded back against its hinges, and a blood-covered nightmare of horror burst into the house. Arthur cried out in shock and terror. The phone fell from his hands. It was a man. His left arm had been torn from his body, his clothes just dirty, ragged shreds that hung from his broken shape in tatters. It groaned. A low, vicious sound of rage in the back of its throat. It saw Arthur, and its sunken, yellowed eyes flashed. It snarled. Arthur Harrigan snatched up the pistol and fired once, hitting the ghoul in the chest. The beast reeled backwards. It crashed against the hallway wall and smeared long streaks of fresh dripping blood on the wallpaper. Then it regained its balance, seemingly driven to frenzy by the roar of the weapon's blast. It snarled at Arthur and lunged for him, its fingers seized into blood-dripping, vicious claws. Arthur jammed the pistol hard against his own temple. His last thought was of his wife. Then he pulled the trigger. Tammy Scott died because she was young and reckless. There was a place down by the river near her childhood home that Tammy would hide when her father came home drunk and her parents began to fight. It was a quiet place, somewhere she could retreat to when life seemed dark and uncertain. She wished she could go there now. She wished for that more than anything else. Because if she were there, in her quiet, happy place, she wouldn't be staring at herself in the mirror and contemplating the dreadful things she was about to do.
Haven't you got higher heels?
No. Margie dropped onto the narrow bed and looked at her friend.
Turn around.
Tammy turned awkwardly, feeling acutely embarrassed.
Mess your hair up. It looks too tidy.
Obediently, Tammy scraped her fingers through her blonde hair, letting it tumble over her shoulders.
Is that denim skirt the shortest one you've got?
Margie ran her eyes up to the tops of her friend's smooth brown thighs. Tammy frowned.
Jesus, Margie. How much shorter can a skirt be? Anything with less material is called a belt.
Margie pulled a face. She stood up.
You've got to give a glimpse of the merchandise,
she said. She unfastened 3 of the buttons on Tammy's white blouse, revealing the lacy tops of her red bra.
Competition is tough. You've got really nice tits. You ought to show them off.
Tammy took a deep breath and wished that she could stop her legs from trembling. She stood still while Margie pulled the collar of her blouse off her shoulder a little, pushed and prodded at her hair, and then painted her lips with bright red lipstick.
You'll do,
Margie sighed.
but don't overprice yourself. You're not 18, you're 22. That means you're old in this game.
Tammy nodded. In the background, she could hear some kind of an urgent news bulletin on the radio. She tried to focus on the sound of the reporter's voice, but Margie was still talking. Tammy frowned, somehow suddenly uneasy. She leaned across to turn the volume up, but Margie slapped at her hand to get her attention.
And try to pretend tonight that you're not a wide-eyed innocent waitress from Corn Poke, Arizona,
Margie insisted.
The reason you haven't had a single date your first 2 nights on the street is because you're scaring the business away. No guy wants to put his money down for a good time with the girl next door. They're looking for Lara Croft.
Tammy turned her head sharply.
What? Girl, they're looking for some action. When I worked the streets, I done real good because I was nasty, full of attitude and up for anything. That's what you gotta do if you want to actually make some money.
Jesus. Tammy cringed.
Most guys cruising for sex are looking for a 16-year-old girl who looks like she's 12.
Margie explained.
You can't compete with that, so you gotta offer something different. You gotta be the experienced, confident score. How can I possibly do that?
Tammy fretted.
Margie, I've only had one boyfriend, and that was 3 years ago. I can't do experience. I can't. Just wiggle your ass and walk like you own it,
Margie said.
and be confident. When a car pulls up at the curb, you saunter over, lean in the window so that they can get a good look down your top, and ask in a real sexy voice if they want to party. It's easy. Easy for you, maybe.
Margie rolled her eyes.
Honey, the rule in this game is that you gotta fake it until you make it.
Tammy's hands were bunched into anxious fists. She took one last look at herself in the mirror and cringed. She threw her handbag over her shoulder and tried to keep her balance on the threadbare carpet.
I don't want to make it,
Tammy said.
I am just doing this to make ends meet. Make it. Make ends meet. It's all the same thing, honey. That's why Angela's going to meet you in the alley.
Margie said.
Tonight I'll take you to the corner and keep watch. I told you I don't want anything to do with Angelo.
Tammy hissed.
This isn't a career, Margie. It's just for a few nights until I can replace the rent money. I don't want to be one of Angelo's working girls. You ain't got a choice,
Margie said.
You struck out 2 nights in a row on your own. Angelo has connections. It's worth the cut he takes. He's a pimp, you mean? He's protection.
Margie insisted. Tammy sighed. It was probably Angelo who had smashed her apartment window and robbed her, for all she knew.
Fine. I'll meet him in the alley. Then I'll decide.
Margie made another face.
Just don't piss him off,
She said.
I know what you can be like. This is business, so keep your thoughts to yourself. It don't matter if you don't like him. It only matters that he protects you and makes sure you get paid. Remember, whatever you do, don't get him angry. Your boyfriend is an asshole,
Tammy said.
Be that as it may,
Margie said primly.
but he's my asshole. And he's your bodyguard. We both need him.
Tammy bit her lip. She looked around her tiny apartment bedroom one last time, and then picked up her keys from the bedside table.
Will you still be here when I get back? Where else would I go?
Margie asked. Tammy kissed Margie on the cheek and tottered through the door, down the dark, rickety staircase, and out through the building's side exit. The alley was narrow, walled on either side by dilapidated high-rise apartment blocks. Tammy glanced up through the crisscross maze of rusting fire escapes and curtained windows to the night sky. There were no stars. The night was black, and she could smell smoke in the air. The alley wasn't dark. City lights filled the narrow back street with a flickering glow as traffic snaked past garish neon signs. Tammy stepped past piled plastic bags of trash and wheeled dumpsters filled to overflowing. There was a huddle of dark shapes in the alley, their bodies silhouetted. Tammy tugged self-consciously at the hem of her denim skirt and walked towards them. Her heels echoed loudly on the ground, and the group of figures changed shape as they turned toward the sound. Then one man broke away from the others and swaggered towards Tammy. Well now, the man's face appeared from the shadows as he neared. Don't you look fine? Tammy stood still inside.
Hi, Angelo.
He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with Latino features and a hawk-like nose. His long, dark hair was pulled back behind his head in a greasy ponytail. He wore a white t-shirt and dirty jeans. He gazed at Tammy with piercing dark eyes and rubbed his chin as he circled her. You've certainly got it going there, girl. He smiled wolfishly. You certainly do. Tammy folded her arms and stared at Angelo listlessly.
Are you finished?
He laughed. Well, actually, I'm only just starting. You see, I gotta taste the goods before I put them on sale, Lily. So how about you and I go somewhere more comfortable and you can show me what you're offering?
No chance.
Tammy sneered.
And I don't think Margie would like to hear what you just said either.
Angelo pointed his finger. Girl, I am serious, he said suddenly. None of my bitches go on the street until I get to sample her wares. That's the way it was for Margie when she worked, and is the way it is for every other bitch I protect. You ain't special. He closed the space between them, his expression dark, his eyes menacing. Tammy took an uncertain step back. She heard a police siren wailing somewhere close by, and the night seemed alive with frenetic noise and bustle. She blocked it all out and focused on the menace in front of her. Angelo's raised voice had drawn the attention of the two other men. They started down the alleyway. Bro, you got trouble? This little bitch ain't a good sharer, he called over his shoulder. It's nothing. The two men exchanged snickers of laughter and turned away. Tammy watched them retreat into the shadows. When she flicked her eyes back to Angelo, there was a leering smile on his face and a short-bladed knife held low in one of his hands.
What the?
I ain't got time to play with you, girl, Angelo said. Every minute you're standing here and not on your back is costing me money. Now my boys think you're giving me lip. That ain't good for my business. Now I know you got a mouth on you. I want to see it go to work. With his free hand, Angelo began to tug at the zipper on his jeans. And if you ever tell Margie I got a free sample, I'll come back with this knife and cut out your tongue. Business is business. You want to be on the game? You gotta play by my rules. Tammy's eyes widened. She took another step away and felt cold, damp bricks against her back. Angelo saw the startled expression in her eyes. Nowhere else to go, he said softly. So it's time to get down and party. Only now we don't do it comfortable. We do it nasty. I'm just gonna throw you down on some trash bags and do you. 'Cause that's what you are now, right? White trash. Tammy couldn't take her eyes off the glinting silver blade. In Angelo's hand it weaved slowly from side to side like the hypnotic dance of a deadly snake. The taste of her fear was thick in her throat. She could feel her heart racing, pounding hard against the cage of her ribs. Angelo drifted closer. It was just one more step, but he was so close now he was within striking distance. Tammy heard him growl at her, and she glanced up at his face. His teeth were bared in a malicious snarl. Tammy slowly eased the strap of her handbag over her shoulder and held up her hands in resignation.
All right,
She whispered.
all right.
Her handbag splashed into a muddy puddle. She brought one of her hands down to the front clasp of her bra, and as Angelo leered at her, she suddenly lashed out with a vicious kick. Tammy's heel socked into Angelo's crotch with a meaty thump. All her anger and fear was behind the blow, and she felt the instant satisfaction as it landed heavily between his legs. For a moment, Angelo froze, and then he slowly toppled sideways like a felled tree, his hands clutching low at his stomach, his face twisted into a rictus of agony. Tammy turned and ran. The darkened alley was a dead end. Tammy knew her only chance of escape was to get past Angelo's two minders. It was the only way out of the alley. She started to run, screaming as loudly as she could.
Help!
She shouted at the two dark shapes. She waved her arms, then doubled over. The men ran towards her, and when she stood up again, she had her heels in her hands.
It's Angelo.
She said breathlessly, her eyes wide.
I think he's been shot.
The two men looked at each other, their expressions stunned. On the ground, deeper into darkened alley, they could see Angelo writhing on the pavement. Tammy raced past the men. As she got nearer to the corner, the light from the city and the noise of passing traffic grew louder and more chaotic. A police car flashed past at high speed, and then she heard a woman's chilling scream and a screech of brakes. Tammy ran out of the alley and turned left without thinking, then froze. The world was on fire. The laundromat and a Chinese restaurant on the corner were ablaze, and there were scattered groups of terrified people running in all directions. Some were carrying suitcases. Others were carrying guns. Their faces were ghastly white and filled with manic horror. She saw one man swing a baseball bat at a car's window, but the sound of the glass shattering was drowned out by the panicked screams of three women who were running straight towards her. Tammy stared in confusion and sudden panic. The frantic fear on the women's faces and the chilling sound of their shrieks above the clamor of wailing sirens and alarms was infectious. She felt herself overcome by an ominous sense of dread. Then, from a dark alley across the road, Tammy saw two blood-drenched figures emerge onto the sidewalk. They were big, bulky shapes, moving briskly towards her, lit by the bright orange glow of the burning buildings. Tammy screamed. A surge of panic filled her. One of the figures was naked. Tammy could see the man's chest had been torn open. Its entrails hung in long, twisted, slimy ropes as it moved, and its face was a mask of dripping blood. It hissed at Tammy, and there was an enraged, murderous frenzy in its eyes. She turned to run, but suddenly a figure crashed through the glass front of the Chinese restaurant. It was a man, and he was on fire. He lumbered across the sidewalk and onto the street, twisting and turning and squealing in a blazing pyre like a human torch until it seemed he could go no further and finally collapsed to his knees in the middle of the road. Horns blared. Tires screeched. And then a dark-colored SUV came hurtling past at high speed and crashed the burning man to the ground. Tammy screamed again. Headlights blinded her, and panicked voices shouted violent abuse. She turned to flee, chinking past a middle-aged man who was carrying a television set in his arms, then stepped out onto the road and lost her footing. Tammy staggered, whirled round in terror, and fell directly into the path of a swerving, speeding car. Jack Cutter survived because a wall fell on him. He was running for his life, sweat staining the front of his t-shirt. His breathing labored. All around him the world was going to hell, and he didn't know why. It had happened within a matter of moments. One minute he was parking his pickup and walking towards the center of town under a clear blue sky. And the next he was struggling to stay alive as the street filled with hordes of screaming, terrified people, and the air overhead thumped with the heavy, vibrating beat of helicopter rotors. The windows of a department store exploded outwards in a fireball of searing hot flame and deadly shards of glass. The shock of the blast was so fierce that the ground around him trembled and the sidewalk seemed to heave beneath his feet. A woman in front of him tripped and fell, and Cutter stumbled over her. The concrete smeared skin from his hands, and for a stunned moment he could only lay still, covering his face from the scattering feet and legs all around him. The noise was deafening. The panic-stricken screams of office workers and mothers who clutched desperately at their children, all overlaid by the constant thump of the helicopters and the plaintive wail of car horns as horrified motorists abandoned their vehicles and fled the madness on foot. Cutter heard a sporadic volley of ragged gunfire from somewhere close behind, and the sound was enough to galvanize him. He struggled to his feet, bumped and jostled by the mindless horde. The scene was chaotic. Thick smoke was billowing from the upper stories of the burning department store, and he could see a woman in a white blouse at a third-floor window. She was screaming, flailing her arms in a desperate plea for help. Then she just disappeared, violently jerked out of sight by a strong, clutching arm. Overhead, 2 Army helicopters were circling the madness, tilting in a series of sharp turns and weaving above the city's rooftops. Cutter heard a ragged burst of machine gun fire and saw the winking red flashes of light, and stood frozen and appalled as he realized the choppers were firing into the confusion. He turned and ran. The sound of the crowd's panic undulated like a wave of noise, rising and falling like a heart-gripping herald of doom. Gunfire ripped through the air indiscriminately, stitching ragged fragments from the blacktop and sawing through cars and people. The street billowed in fresh pyres of smoke and flame, and the crowd's panic turned to hysteria. A 4-wheel drive suddenly broke from the jammed line of abandoned cars, shunting and crumpling its way up onto the sidewalk and scything a path through the teeming crowds. The desperate scattered, but those who were too slow to react were tossed over the hood like broken debris, or dragged under the savage tread of the huge terrain tires. The motor roared as the vehicle veered in wild arcs, crashing into benches and trash cans. Cutter heard the howl of the revving engine and turned just in time. He saw the wild, wide eyes of the driver behind the windshield, saw the man's mouth open in a roar of frantic panic, and threw himself sideways. He felt the fender of the truck smash his foot a glancing blow, and then he crashed into a doorway as the big roaring vehicle careered over the woman who had fallen in front of Cutter, crushing and killing her instantly. The vehicle rocked wildly on its suspension. The left side wheels became airborne, and the right side wheels dug into the gutter in a wicked howl of smoke and rubber. The vehicle teetered sideways, its momentum carrying it into the front of a burger shop on the corner of the block. The collision stopped the vehicle dead, and the driver was hurled through the windshield head first by the shocking impact. He was torn to pieces by the falling, shattering glass of the shop front, and his body impaled to the hood of his vehicle. The awning over the front of the building collapsed in a scream of rending metal and crumbling bricks. Cutter tucked himself into a ball and covered his head with his hands. Thick dust and debris enveloped him as the front of the building slowly began to fall, and the noise around him sounded loud as the end of the world. For long moments of eerie, stunned silence, Cutter lay perfectly still. When he finally opened his eyes, his world was a small, tight space of rubble and billowing dust. He coughed, spat gritty dirt from his mouth, and dragged his hands across his face and eyes. He saw jagged shapes of daylight, and he kicked out at the debris that pinned his legs. Slowly, he turned his head sideways. There was a dead man lying close beside him, his body cleaved in half by a ragged piece of iron. A warm pool of blood was leaking across the sidewalk, congealing into a brown kind of mud. Beside the carnage was the shape of another man in a white shirt and trousers who had his back to him. Cutter rolled onto his side and reached out with his fingers. The man flinched, and then raised a feeble hand to his face. Cutter sat up. Iron girders and broken masonry lay in fractured, twisted chaos all around him. He got to his knees, then hunched over and coughed again. He could see the side of the four-wheel drive. The roof of the vehicle had been crushed flat under the weight of the awning. He could see the driver's legs hanging limp across the hood, but nothing more. The man in the white shirt rolled onto his back and groaned. His face was a mask of gray dust, and there was a bleeding gash on his cheek. His shirt was covered in dirt and spattered blood, but he was breathing. Cutter crawled over the dead body and shook the man's shoulders. "You all right?" Cutter croaked. The man groaned again. Cutter crouched over the man and pushed away a piece of iron sheeting. Through the space he could see the city street. Buildings were on fire. The air was thick with billowing clouds of black smoke, but overhead the army helicopters still circled vengefully, dipping low in strafing runs like prehistoric predators, their powerful rotors ripping through the haze as the machine guns continued to fire. Wrecked, mangled cars choked the street. Alarms sounded piercing and plaintive. People cried out in fear and pain. And on the sidewalk, not 20 feet away, Cutter noticed a woman in a gray business suit hunched over the body of a young girl wearing a bright summer dress. The woman was drenched in blood, and for an instant, Cutter thought she was trying to rouse the child and rescue it. Then he saw the woman's head coil back, pause, and lunge at the child's neck to gorge on the girl's flesh. Cutter's eyes went wide with horror and shock. He heard the woman snarl as she tore at the child's body, and when the woman looked up again, her chin was dripping with blood that spilled all the way down her throat and soaked her blouse. The child was still alive. Cutter saw the girl's thin brown legs thrashing. He watched on, numb with horror. Then the woman's snapping jaws gouged a vicious snarling bite from the girl's face, and after another moment, the child moved no more. Cutter felt his stomach heave and tasted thick, oily bile in the back of his throat. He bunched his fists, filled with black, unholy rage that defied reason. He cried out, shouting through cracked lips at the woman, and grabbed for a piece of twisted iron pipe that had fallen when the awning had collapsed. He took a staggering step towards the woman, and then suddenly felt a hand on his ankle, the grip fierce and desperate. "Don't!" the man lying on the ground beside him gasped. "She's one of the infected." Cutter stared down at the man, incredulous. "Infected?" "The zombie virus," the man said, his voice a dry rasp. "It's been on the news. The whole of Virginia is being overrun." Cutter shook his head, bewildered. He lowered the iron bar and felt a creeping, icy numbness begin to spread through his body. He shook his head again, looked back at the woman, and then beyond her. He could see other figures moving amongst the streaming mass of humanity. Blood-drenched shapes moved slowly, shuffling in the throng, clawing randomly. He saw one of the figures clutch at a running woman's shoulder and pull her off balance. The woman was young, maybe in her 20s. She fell on her back, hitting the ground hard, and was suddenly set upon by two more shambling shapes that seemed instinctively to sense her. The woman had a pistol in her hand. She screamed in fear and fired 3 quick rounds, point blank into one figure's chest, flinging it back against the side of a car. But by then, the other ghoul was tearing the young woman's guts wide open. Cutter heard her scream once more, a loud, blood-chilling cry of agony and terror. and then more running people swept past, and he lost sight of the woman in the chaos. Cutter turned his attention back to the man lying at his feet within the debris of the wrecked building. The guy was groaning painfully, clutching at his chest, and despite the superficial cut to his face, Cutter was pretty sure the man had suffered internal injuries. The guy spat bright red blood onto the sidewalk and wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. He was shaking, maybe going into shock. "Help me," the man pleaded. He was trying to claw himself upright. Cutter heaved him up and felt his weight heavy against him as the man swayed on a damaged ankle. "Broken?" The guy shook his head. "I don't think so," he said, then winced and looked around, as if to get his bearings. He pointed past Cutter's shoulder. "The bookshop," he said. "That's where I work. There's a basement. We need to hide." Cutter followed the direction of the man's arm. Across the street, he could see the shop front for Newbridge City Books. He shook his head. It was an old two-story building that had been built before the Second World War, with delicate, ornate masonry around the upper floor windows and a wide display area on the ground floor beside a dark opening. "We'll never make it," Cutter said. "Not in this madness." The guy sagged heavily. His arm was draped over Cutter's shoulder. "We have to." Cutter stared at the guy. He was in his early 30s, a thin, wiry shape with short hair and a long, sallow face that was screwed up in the agony of his pain. But his eyes were clear and determined. Cutter nodded. "Okay," he said. In the first few moments of madness, the crowd on the streets had moved like a tide of humanity, spilling onto the roads and sidewalks and moving like a mass in one direction that had swept Jack Cutter up and carried him away. But now the crowds had lost their cohesion and direction, so that to Cutter it now seemed like the street had degenerated into an urban warfare battleground. Pitched battles and running skirmishes were being fought as infected zombies clutched and dragged at the fleeing throng, and the victims turned and struggled with frenzied desperation for their lives. The screaming became louder, more piercing. The sounds of sporadic gunfire cracked and echoed between the tall buildings. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but never seemed to come closer. And through it all, the remorseless clatter of the helicopters overhead tore at the air. Cutter kicked aside more fallen bricks, and his boots crunched on broken glass until he was standing on the edge of the sidewalk. The infected woman who was hunched over the body of the dead girl glanced up at Cutter, sensing his movement. Cutter watched the woman and felt a tremor of superstitious dread. For long moments, the undead woman watched him, her mouth open, and there was a dry, retching sound in the back of her throat. Then she got to her feet and hissed.